increased by Mr. Panks. The demeanour of that gentleman at first suggested to her mind that he might be a taker of likenesses, so intently did he look at her, and so frequently did he glance at the little notebook by his side. Observing that he made no sketch, however, and that he talked about business only, she began to have suspicions that he represented some creditor of her father's, the balance due to whom was noted in that pocket volume. Regarded from this point of view, Mr. Panks's puffings expressed injury and impatience, and each of his louder snorts became a demand for payment. But here again she was undeceived by anomalous and incongruous conduct on the part of Mr. Panks himself. She had left the table half an hour and was at work alone. Flora had gone to lie down in the next room, concurrently with which retirement a smell of something to drink had broken out in the house. The patriarch was fast asleep, with his philanthropic mouth open under a yellow pocket-handkerchief in the dining-room. At this quiet time, Mr. Panks softly appeared before her, urbanely nodding. "Find it a little dull, Miss Dorrit?" inquired Panks in a low voice. "No, thank you, sir," said Little Dorrit. "Busy, I see," observed Panks, stealing into the room by inches. "What are those now, Miss Dorrit?" "Handkerchiefs." "Are they, though?" said Panks. "I should have thought it." Not in the least looking at them, but looking at Little Dorrit. "Perhaps you wonder who I am. Shall I tell you? I am a fortune-teller." Little Dorrit now began to think he was mad. "I belong body and soul to my proprietor," said Panks. "You saw my proprietor having his dinner below, but I do a little in the other way sometimes, privately, very privately, Miss Dorrit." Little Dorrit looked at him doubtfully, and not without alarm. "I wish you'd show me the palm of your hand," said Panks. "I should like to have a look at it. Don't let me be troublesome." He was so far troublesome that he was not at all wanted there, but she laid her work in her lap for a moment and held out her left hand with her thimble on it. "Years of toil, eh?" said Panks softly, touching it with his blunt forefinger. "But what else are we made for? Nothing. Hello?" looking into the lines. "What's this with bars? It's a college. And what's this with a grey gown and a black velvet cap? It's a father. And what's this with a clarionet? It's an uncle. And what's this in dancing shoes? It's a sister. And what's this straggling about in an idle sort of a way? It's a brother. And what's this thinking of 'em all? Why, this is you, Miss Dorrit." Her eyes met his as she looked up wonderingly into his face, and she thought that although his were sharp eyes, he was a brighter and gentler-looking man than she had supposed at dinner. His eyes were on her hand again directly, and her opportunity of confirming or correcting the impression were gone. "Now, the deuce is in it," muttered Panks, tracing out a line in her hand with his clumsy finger. "If this isn't me in the corner here, what do I want here? What's behind me?" He carried his finger slowly down to the wrist and round the wrist, and affected to look at the back of the hand for what was behind him. "Is it any harm?" asked Little Dorrit, smiling. "Deuce a bit," said Panks. "What do you think it's worth?" "I ought to ask you that. I am not the fortune-teller." "True," said Panks. "What's it worth?" "You shall live to see, Miss Dorrit." Releasing the hand by slow degrees, he drew all his fingers through his prongs of hair so that they stood up in their most portentous manner, and repeated slowly, "Remember what I say, Miss Dorrit. You shall live to see." She could not help showing that she was much surprised, if it were only by his knowing so much about her. "Ah, that's it," said Panks, pointing at her. "Miss Dorrit, not that. Ever." More surprised than before, and a little more frightened, she looked to him for an explanation of his last words. "Not that," said Panks, making with great seriousness an imitation of a surprised look and manner that appeared to be unintentionally grotesque. "Don't do that. Never on seeing me, no matter when, no matter where. I am nobody. Don't take on to mind me. Don't mention me. Take no notice. Will you agree, Miss Dorrit?" "I hardly know what to say," returned Little Dorrit, quite astounded. "Why?" "Because I am a fortune-teller. Hanks the gypsy. I haven't told you so much of your fortune yet, Miss Dorrit, as to tell you what's behind me on that little hand. I have told you all you shall live to see. Is it agreed, Miss Dorrit? Agreed that I am to take no notice of me away from here unless I take on first. Not to mind me when I come and go. It's very easy. I am at no loss. I am not handsome. I am not good company. I am only my proprietor's grubber. You need do no more than think. Ah, Hanks, the gypsy, at his fortune-telling. He'll tell the rest of my fortune one day. I shall live to know it. Is it agreed, Miss Dorrit? Yes, faltered Little Dorrit, whom he greatly confused. I suppose so, while you do no harm. Good. Mr. Panks glanced at the wall of the adjoining room and stooped forward. Honest creature, woman of capital points, but heedless and a loose talker, Miss Dorrit. With that, he rubbed his hands, as if the interview had been very satisfactory to him, panted away to the door, and urbanely nodded himself out again. If Little Dorrit were beyond measure perplexed by this curious conduct on the part of her new acquaintance, and by finding herself involved in this singular treaty, her perplexity was not diminished by ensuing circumstances. Besides that, Mr. Panks took every opportunity afforded him in Mr. Casby's house of significantly glancing at her and snorting at her, which was not much, after what he had done already. He began to pervade her daily life. She saw him in the street constantly. When she went to Mr. Casby's, he was always there. When she went to Mrs. Clennam's, he came there on any pretence, as if to keep her in his sight. A week had not gone by when she found him, to her astonishment, in the lodge one night, conversing with the turnkey on duty, and to all appearance one of his familiar companions. Her next surprise was to find him equally at his ease within the prison, to hear of his presenting himself among the visitors at her father's Sunday levee, to see him arm in arm with a collegiate friend about the yard, to learn from fame that he had greatly distinguished himself one evening at the social club that held its meetings in the snuggery, by addressing a speech to the members of the institution, singing a song, and treating the company to 5 gallons of ale. Report madly added a bushel of shrimps. The effect on Mr. Plornish of such of these phenomena as he became an eye-witness of in his faithful visits made an impression on Little Dorrit only second to that produced by the phenomena themselves. They seemed to gag and bind him. He could only stare and sometimes weakly mutter that it wouldn't be believed down Bleeding Heart Yard that this was Panks, but he never said a word more, or made a sign more, even to Little Dorrit. Mr. Panks crowned his mysteries by making himself acquainted with Tip in some unknown manner, and taking a Sunday saunter into the college on that gentleman's arm. Throughout, he never took any notice of Little Dorrit, save once or twice when he happened to come close to her, and there was no one very near, on which occasions he said in passing, with a friendly look and a puff of encouragement, "Hanks, the gypsy, fortune-telling." Little Dorrit worked and strove as usual, wondering at all this, but keeping her wonder, as she had from her earliest years kept many heavier loads, in her own breast. A change had stolen, and was stealing yet, over the patient heart. Every day found her something more retiring than the day before. To pass in and out of the prison unnoticed, and elsewhere to be overlooked and forgotten, were, for herself, her chief desires. To her own room, too, strangely assorted room for her delicate youth and character, she was glad to retreat as often as she could without desertion of any duty. There were afternoon times when she was unemployed, when visitors dropped in to play a hand at cards with her father, when she could be spared and was better away. Then she would flit along the yard, climb the scores of stairs that led to her room, and take her seat at the window. Many combinations did those spikes upon the wall assume, many light shapes did the strong iron weave itself into, many golden touches fell upon the rust, while Little Dorrit sat there musing. New zigzags sprung into the cruel pattern sometimes, when she saw it through a burst of tears, but beautified or hardened still, always over it and under it and through it, she was fain to look in her solitude, seeing everything with that ineffaceable brand. A garret, and a Marshalsea garret without compromise, was little Dorrit's room. Beautifully kept, it was ugly in itself, and had little but cleanliness and air to set it off, for what embellishment she had ever been able to buy had gone to her father's room. Howbeit, for this poor place she showed an increasing love, and to sit in it alone became her favourite rest. Insomuch that on a certain afternoon during the Pankses' mysteries, when she was seated at her window and heard Maggie's well-known step coming up the stairs, she was very much disturbed by the apprehension of being summoned away. As Maggie's step came higher up and nearer, she trembled and faltered, and it was as much as she could do to speak when Maggie at length appeared. "Please, little mother," said Maggie, panting for breath, "you must come down and see him. He's here." "Who, Maggie?" "Oh, of course, Mr. Clennam. He's in your father's room, and he says to me, 'Maggie, will you be so kind and go and say it's only me?'" "I'm not very well, Maggie. I had better not go. I am going to lie down. See, I lie down now to ease my head. Say with my grateful regard that you left me so, or I would have come." "Well, it ain't very polite, though, little mother," said the staring Maggie, "to turn your face away, neither." Maggie was very susceptible to personal slights, and very ingenious in inventing them. "Putting both your hands afore your face, too," she went on. "If you can't bear the looks of a poor thing, it would be better to tell her so at once, and not go and shut her out like that, hurting her feelings and breaking her heart, 10-year-old, poor thing." "It's to ease my head, Maggie." "Well, if you cry to ease your head, little mother, let me cry too. Don't go and have all the crying to yourself," expostulated Maggie. "That ain't no being greedy," and immediately began to blubber. It was with some difficulty that she could be induced to go back with the excuse, but the promise of being told a story, of old her great delight, on condition that she concentrated her faculties upon the errand and left her little mistress to herself for an hour longer, combined with a misgiving on Maggie's part that she had left her good temper at the bottom of the staircase, prevailed. So away she went, muttering her message all the way to keep it in her mind, and at the appointed time came back. "He was very sorry, I can tell you," she announced, "and wanted to send a doctor, and he's coming again tomorrow, he is, and I don't think he'll have a good sleep tonight, along o' hearing about your head, little mother. Oh my, ain't you been a-crying?" "I think I have, a little, Maggie." "A little? Oh! But it's all over now, all over for good, Maggie. And my head is much better and cooler, and I am quite comfortable. I'm very glad I did not go down." Her great staring child tenderly embraced her, and having smoothed her hair and bathed her forehead and her eyes with cold water, offices in which her awkward hands became skilful, hugged her again, exulted in her brighter looks, and stationed her in her chair by the window. Over against this chair Maggie, with apoplectic exertions that were not at all required, dragged the box which was her seat on story-telling occasions, sat down upon it, hugged her own knees, and said, with a voracious appetite for stories, and with widely opened eyes, "Now, little mother, let's have a good 'un." "What shall it be about, Maggie?" "Oh, let's have a princess," said Maggie, "and let her be a regular one, beyond all belief, you know." Little Dorrit considered for a moment, and with a rather sad smile upon her face, which was flushed by the sunset, began. "Maggie, there was once upon a time a fine king, and he had everything he could wish for, and a great deal more. He had gold and silver, diamonds and rubies, riches of every kind. He had palaces, and he had—" "Hospitals," interposed Maggie, still nursing her knees. "Let him have hospitals, because they're so comfortable. Hospitals with lots of chicken." "Yes, he had plenty of them, and he had plenty of everything. Plenty of baked potatoes, for instance," said Maggie. "Plenty of everything." "Law," chuckled Maggie, giving her knees a hug, "wasn't it prime?" This king had a daughter who was the wisest and most beautiful princess that ever was seen. When she was a child, she understood all her lessons before her master taught them to her, and when she was grown up, she was the wonder of the world. Now, near the palace where this princess lived, there was a cottage, in which there was a poor little tiny woman who lived all alone by herself. An old woman, said Maggie, with an unctuous smack of her lips. No, not an old woman, quite a young one. I wonder she aren't afraid, said Maggie. Go on, please. The princess passed the cottage nearly every day, and whenever she went by in her beautiful carriage, she saw the poor tiny woman spinning at her wheel, and she looked at the tiny woman, and the tiny woman looked at her. So one day she stopped the coachman a little way from the cottage and got out and walked on and peeped in at the door, and there, as usual, was the tiny woman spinning at her wheel, and she looked at the princess, and the princess looked at her. Like trying to stare one another out, said Maggie. Please go on, little mother. The princess was such a wonderful princess that she had the power of knowing secrets, and she said to the tiny woman, Why do you keep it there? This showed her directly that the princess knew why she lived all alone by herself spinning at her wheel, and she kneeled down at the princess's feet and asked her never to betray her. So the princess said, I will never betray you. Let me see it. So the tiny woman closed the shutter of the cottage window and fastened the door, and trembling from head to foot for fear that anyone should suspect her, opened a very secret place and showed the princess a shadow. Lor, said Maggie. It was the shadow of someone who had gone by long before, of someone who had gone on far away, quite out of reach, never to come back. It was bright to look at, and when the tiny woman showed it to the princess, she was proud of it with all her heart as a great, great treasure. When the princess had considered it a little while, she said to the tiny woman, And you keep watch over this every day? And she cast down her eyes and whispered, Yes. Then the princess said, Remind me why. To which the other replied that no one so good and kind had ever passed that way, and that was why, in the beginning. She said, too, that nobody missed it, that nobody was the worse for it, that someone had gone on to those who were expecting him. Someone was a man, then? Interposed Maggie. Little Dorrit timidly said yes, she believed so, and resumed. Had gone on to those who were expecting him, and that this remembrance was stolen or kept back from nobody. The princess made answer, Ah, but when the cottager died, it would be discovered there. The tiny woman told her no. When that time came, it would sink quietly into her own grave and would never be found. Well, to be sure, said Maggie. Go on, please. The princess was very much astonished to hear this, as you may suppose, Maggie, and well she might be, said Maggie. So she resolved to watch the tiny woman and see what came of it. Every day she drove in her beautiful carriage by the cottage door, and there she saw the tiny woman always alone by herself spinning at her wheel, and she looked at the tiny woman, and the tiny woman looked at her. At last, one day, the wheel was still, and the tiny woman was not to be seen. When the princess made inquiries why the wheel had stopped, and where the tiny woman was, she was informed that the wheel had stopped because there was nobody to turn it, the tiny woman being dead. They ought to have took her to the hospital, said Maggie, and then she'd have got over it. The princess, after crying a very little for the loss of the tiny woman, dried her eyes and got out of her carriage at the place where she had stopped it before, and went to the cottage and peeped in at the door. There was nobody to look at her now, and nobody for her to look at, so she went in at once to search for the treasured shadow. But there was no sign of it to be found anywhere, and then she knew that the tiny woman had told her the truth, and that it would never give anybody any trouble, and that it had sunk quietly into her own grave, and that she and it were at rest together. That's all, Maggie. The sunset flush was so bright on little Dorrit's face when she came thus to the end of her story that she interposed her hand to shade it. Has she got to be old? Maggie asked. The tiny woman. Ah, I don't know, said little Dorrit, but it would have been just the same if she had been ever so old. Would it really? Said Maggie. Well, I suppose it would, though, and sat staring and ruminating. She sat so long with her eyes wide open that at length little Dorrit, to entice her from her box, rose and looked out of window. As she glanced down into the yard, she saw Panks come in and leer up with the corner of his eye as he went by. "Who's he, little mother?" said Maggie. She had joined her at the window and was leaning on her shoulder. "I see him come in and out often." "I have heard him called a fortune-teller," said little Dorrit, "but I doubt if he could tell many people even their past or present fortunes." "Couldn't have told the princess hers," said Maggie. Little Dorrit, looking musingly down into the dark valley of the prison, shook her head. "Nor the tiny woman hers," said Maggie. "No," said little Dorrit, with the sunset very bright upon her. "But let us come away from the window." Chapter 25. Conspirators and Others. The private residence of Mr. Panks was in Pentonville, where he lodged on the second floor of a professional gentleman in an extremely small way, who had an inner door within the street door, poised on a spring and starting open with a click like a trap, and who wrote up in the fanlight, "Rugg, General Agent, Accountant, Debts Recovered." This scroll, majestic in its severe simplicity, illuminated a little slip of front garden abutting on the thirsty highroad, where a few of the dustiest of leaves hung their dismal heads and led a life of choking. A professor of writing occupied the first floor, and enlivened the garden railings with glass cases, containing choice examples of what his pupils had been before 6 lessons, and while the whole of his young family shook the table, and what they had become after 6 lessons, when the young family was under restraint. The tenancy of Mr. Panks was limited to one airy bedroom, he covenanting and agreeing with Mr. Rugg, his landlord, that in consideration of a certain scale of payments accurately defined, and on certain verbal notice duly given, he should be at liberty to elect to share the Sunday breakfast, dinner, tea, or supper, or each or any or all of those repasts or meals of Mr. and Miss Rugg, his daughter, in the back parlour. Miss Rugg was a lady of little property, which she had acquired, together with much distinction in the neighbourhood, by having her heart severely lacerated and her feelings mangled by a middle-aged baker resident in the vicinity, against whom she had, by the agency of Mr. Rugg, found it necessary to proceed at law to recover damages for a breach of promise of marriage. The baker having been, by the counsel for Miss Rugg, witheringly denounced on that occasion up to the full amount of 20 guineas, at the rate of about 18 pence an epithet, and having been cast in corresponding damages, still suffered occasional persecution from the youth of Pentonville. But Miss Rugg, environed by the majesty of the law, and having her damages invested in the public securities, was regarded with consideration. In the society of Mr. Rugg, who had a round white visage, as if all his blushes had been drawn out of him long ago, and who had a ragged yellow head like a worn-out hearth broom, and in the society of Miss Rugg, who had little nankeen spots, like shirt-buttons, all over her face, and whose own yellow tresses were rather scrubby than luxuriant, Mr. Panks had usually dined on Sundays for some few years, and had twice a week or so enjoyed an evening collation of bread, Dutch cheese, and porter. Mr. Panks was one of the very few marriageable men for whom Miss Rugg had no terrors, the argument with which he reassured himself being twofold, that is to say, firstly, that it wouldn't do twice, and secondly, that he wasn't worth it. Fortified within this double armour, Mr. Panks snorted at Miss Rugg on easy terms. Up to this time, Mr. Panks had transacted little or no business at his quarters in Pentonville, except in the sleeping line, but now that he had become a fortune-teller, he was often closeted after midnight with Mr. Rugg in his little front parlour office, and even after those untimely hours burnt tallow in his bedroom. Though his duties as his proprietor's grubber were in no wise lessened, and though that service bore no greater resemblance to a bed of roses than was to be discovered in its many thorns, some new branch of industry made a constant demand upon him. When he cast off the patriarch at night, it was only to take an anonymous craft in tow and labour away afresh in other waters. The advance from a personal acquaintance with the elder Mr. Chivery to an introduction to his amiable wife and disconsolate son may have been easy, but easy or not, Mr. Panks soon made it. He nestled in the bosom of the tobacco business within a week or two after his first appearance in the college, and particularly addressed himself to the cultivation of a good understanding with young John. In this endeavour he so prospered as to lure that pining shepherd forth from the groves and tempt him to undertake mysterious missions, on which he began to disappear at uncertain intervals for as long as a space as 2 or 3 days together. The prudent Mrs. Chivery, who wondered greatly at this change, would have protested against it, as detrimental to the Highland typification on the doorpost, but for 2 forcible reasons. 1, that her John was roused to take strong interest in the business which these starts were supposed to advance, and that this she held to be good for his drooping spirits. The other, that Mr. Panks confidently agreed to pay her for the occupation of her son's time at the handsome rate of 7 and 6pence per day. The proposal originated with himself, and was couched in the pithy terms, "If your John is weak enough, ma'am, not to take it, that is no reason why you should be, don't you see? So, quite between ourselves, ma'am, business being business, here it is." When Mr. Chivery thought of these things, or how much or how little he knew about them, was never gathered from himself. It has been already remarked that he was a man of few words, and it may be here observed that he had imbibed a professional habit of locking everything up. He locked himself up as carefully as he locked up the Marshalsea debtors. Even his custom of bolting his meals may have been a part of an uniform whole, but there is no question that, as to all other purposes, he kept his mouth as he kept the Marshalsea door. He never opened it without occasion. When it was necessary to let anything out, he opened it a little way, held it open just as long as sufficed for the purpose, and locked it again. Even as he would be sparing of his trouble at the Marshalsea door, and would keep a visitor who wanted to go out waiting for a few moments if he saw another visitor coming down the yard, so that one turn of the key should suffice for both. Similarly, he would often reserve a remark if he perceived another on its way to his lips, and would deliver himself of the 2 together. As to any key to his inner knowledge being to be found in his face, the Marshalsea key was as legible as an index to the individual characters and histories upon which it was turned. That Mr. Panks should be moved to invite any one to dinner at Pentonville was an unprecedented fact in his calendar. But he invited young John to dinner, and even brought him within range of the dangerous because expensive fascinations of Miss Rugg. The banquet was appointed for a Sunday, and Miss Rugg with her own hands stuffed a leg of mutton with oysters on the occasion, and sent it to the baker's, not the baker's, but an opposition establishment. Provision of oranges, apples, and nuts was also made, and rum was brought home by Mr. Panks on Saturday night to gladden the visitor's heart. The store of creature comforts was not the chief part of the visitor's reception. Its special feature was a foregone family confidence and sympathy. When young John appeared at 1:30 without the ivory hand and waistcoat of golden sprigs, the sun shorn of his beams by disastrous clouds, Mr. Panks presented him to the yellow-haired Ruggs as the young man he had so often mentioned who loved Miss Dorrit. "I am glad," said Mr. Rugg, challenging him specially in that character, "to have the distinguished gratification of making your acquaintance, sir. Your feelings do you honour. You are young. May you never outlive your feelings. If I was to outlive my own feelings, sir," said Mr. Rugg, who was a man of many words and was considered to possess a remarkably good address, "if I was to outlive my own feelings, I'd leave £50 in my will to the man who would put me out of existence." Miss Rugg heaved a sigh. "My daughter, sir," said Mr. Rugg, "Anastasia, you are no stranger to the state of this young man's affections." "My daughter has had her trials, sir." Mr. Rugg might have used the word more pointedly in the singular number. "And she can feel for you." Young John, almost overwhelmed by the touching nature of this greeting, professed himself to that effect. "What I envy you, sir, is," said Mr. Rugg, Allow me to take your hat. We are rather short of pegs. I'll put it in the corner. Nobody will tread on it there. What I envy you, sir, is the luxury of your own feelings. I belong to a profession in which that luxury is sometimes denied us." Young John replied with acknowledgments that he only hoped he did what was right, and what showed how entirely he was devoted to Miss Dorrit. He wished to be unselfish, and he hoped he was. He wished to do anything as laid in his power to serve Miss Dorrit, altogether putting himself out of sight, and he hoped he did. It was but little that he could do, but he hoped he did it. "Sir," said Mr. Rugg, taking him by the hand, "you are a young man that it does one good to come across. You are a young man that I should like to put in the witness box, to humanize the minds of the legal profession. I hope you have brought your appetite with you, and intend to play a good knife and fork." "Thank you, sir," returned young John. "I don't eat much at present." Mr. Rugg drew him a little apart. "My daughter's case, sir," said he, "at the time when, in vindication of her outraged feelings and her sex, she became the plaintiff in Rugg and Borkins. I suppose I could have put it in evidence, Mr. Chivery, if I had thought it worth my while, that the amount of solid sustenance my daughter consumed at that period did not exceed 10 ounces per week." "I think I go a little beyond that, sir," returned the other, hesitating, as if he confessed it with some shame. "But in your case there's no fiend in human form," said Mr. Rugg, with argumentative smile and action of hand. "Observe, Mr. Chivery. No fiend in human form." "No, certainly, sir," young John added with simplicity. "I should be very sorry if there was." "The sentiment," said Mr. Rugg, "is what I should have expected from your known principles. It would affect my daughter greatly, sir, if she heard it. As I perceive the mutton, I am glad she didn't hear it. Mr. Pranks, on this occasion, pray face me. My dear, face Mr. Chivery. For what we are going to receive, may we and Miss Dorrit be truly thankful." But for a grave waggishness in Mr. Rugg's manner of delivering this introduction to the feast, it might have appeared that Miss Dorrit was expected to be one of the company. Pankses recognized the sally in his usual way, and took in his provender in his usual way. Miss Rugg, perhaps making up some of her arrears, likewise took very kindly to the mutton, and it rapidly diminished to the bone. A bread and butter pudding entirely disappeared, and a considerable amount of cheese and radishes vanished by the same means. Then came the dessert. Then also, and before the broaching of the rum and water, came Mr. Panks's notebook. The ensuing business proceedings were brief but curious, and rather in the nature of a conspiracy. Mr. Panks looked over his notebook, which was now getting full, studiously, and picked out little extracts, which he wrote on separate slips of paper on the table. Mr. Rugg, in the meanwhile, looking at him with close attention, and young John losing his uncollected eye in mists of meditation. When Mr. Panks, who supported the character of chief conspirator, had completed his extracts, he looked over them, corrected them, put up his notebook, and held them like a hand at cards. "Now, there's a churchyard in Bedfordshire," said Panks. "Who takes it?" "I'll take it, sir," returned Mr. Rugg, "if no one bids." Mr. Panks dealt him his card, and looked at his hand again. "Now, there's an inquiry in York," said Panks. "Who takes it?" "I'm not good for York," said Mr. Rugg. "Then perhaps," pursued Panks, "you'll be so obliging, John Chivery." Young John assenting, Panks dealt him his card, and consulted his hand again. "There's a church in London, I may as well take that, and a family Bible, I may as well take that too. That's 2 to me, repeated Panks, breathing hard over his cards. "Here's a clerk at Durham for you, John, and an old seafaring gentleman at Dunstable for you, Mr. Rugg. 2 to me, was it? Yes, 2 to me. Here's a stone, 3 to me, and a stillborn baby, 4 to me, and all for the present told." When he had thus disposed of his cards, all being done very quietly and in a suppressed tone, Mr. Panks puffed his way into his own breast-pocket and tugged out a canvas bag, from which, with a sparing hand, he told forth money for travelling expenses in 2 little portions. "Cash goes out fast," he said anxiously, as he pushed a portion to each of his male companions. "Very fast." "I can only assure you, Mr. Panks," said young John, "that I deeply regret my circumstances being such that I can't afford to pay my own charges, or that it's not advisable to allow me the time necessary for my doing the distances on foot, because nothing would give me greater satisfaction than to walk myself off my legs without fee or reward. This young man's disinterestedness appeared so very ludicrous in the eyes of Miss Rugg that she was obliged to effect a precipitate retirement from the company, and to sit upon the stairs until she had had her laugh out. Meanwhile, Mr. Panks, looking not without some pity at young John, slowly and thoughtfully twisted up his canvas bag as if he were wringing its neck. The lady, returning as he restored it to his pocket, mixed rum and water for the party, not forgetting her fair self, and handed to every one his glass. When all was supplied, Mr. Rugg rose, and silently holding out his glass at arm's length above the centre of the table, by that gesture invited the other three to add theirs, and to unite in a general conspiratorial clink. The ceremony was effective up to a certain point, and would have been wholly so throughout, if Miss Rugg, as she raised her glass to her lips in completion of it, had not happened to look at young John, when she was again so overcome by the contemptible comicality of his disinterestedness as to splutter some ambrosial drops of rum and water around, and withdrew in confusion. Such was the dinner without precedent, given by Panks at Pentonville, and such was the busy and strange life Panks led. The only waking moments at which he appeared to relax from his cares, and to recreate himself by going anywhere or saying anything without a pervading object, were when he showed a dawning interest in the lame foreigner with the stick down Bleeding Heart Yard. The foreigner, by name Jean-Baptiste Cavaletto, they called him Mr. Baptiste in the yard, was such a chirping, easy, hopeful little fellow that his attraction for Panks was probably in the force of contrast. Solitary, weak, and scantily acquainted with the most necessary words of the only language in which he could communicate with the people about him, he went with the stream of his fortunes in a brisk way that was new in those parts. With little to eat and less to drink, and nothing to wear but what he wore upon him, or had brought tied up in one of the smallest bundles that ever were seen, he put as bright a face upon it as if he were in the most flourishing circumstances when he first hobbled up and down the yard, humbly propitiating the general goodwill with his white teeth. It was uphill work for a foreigner, lame or sound, to make his way with the Bleeding Hearts. In the first place, they were vaguely persuaded that every foreigner had a knife about him. In the second, they held it to be a sound constitutional national axiom that he ought to go home to his own country. They never thought of inquiring how many of their own countrymen would be returned upon their hands from divers parts of the world if the principle were generally recognized. They considered it particularly and peculiarly British. In the third place, they had a notion that it was a sort of divine visitation upon a foreigner that he was not an Englishman, and that all kinds of calamities happened to his country because it did things that England did not, and did not do things that England did. In this belief, to be sure, they had long been carefully trained by the Barnacles and Stiltstalkings, who were always proclaiming to them, officially, that no country which failed to submit itself to those two large families could possibly hope to be under the protection of Providence, and who, when they believed it, disparaged them in private as the most prejudiced people under the sun. This, therefore, might be called a political position of the Bleeding Hearts, but they entertained other objections to having foreigners in the yard. They believed that foreigners were always badly off, and though they were as ill off themselves as they could desire to be, that did not diminish the force of the objection. They believed that foreigners were dragooned and bayoneted, and though they certainly got their own skulls promptly fractured if they showed any ill humour, still it was with a blunt instrument, and that didn't count. They believed that foreigners were always immoral, and though they had an occasional assize at home, and now and then a divorce case or so, that had nothing to do with it. They believed that foreigners had no independent spirit, as never being escorted to the pole in droves by Lord Decimus Tite Barnacle, with colours flying and the tune of Rule Britannia playing. Not to be tedious, they had many other beliefs of a similar kind. Against these obstacles, the lame foreigner with the stick had to make head as well as he could, not absolutely single-handed, because Mr. Arthur Clennam had recommended him to the Plornishes. He lived at the top of the same house, but still at heavy odds. However, the Bleeding Hearts were kind hearts, and when they saw the little fellow cheerily limping about with a good-humoured face, doing no harm, drawing no knives, committing no outrageous immoralities, living chiefly on farinaceous and milk diet, and playing with Mrs. Plornish's children of an evening, they began to think that although he could never hope to be an Englishman, still it would be hard to visit that affliction on his head. They began to accommodate themselves to his level, calling him Mr. Baptiste, but treating him like a baby and laughing immoderately at his lively gestures and his childish English, more because he didn't mind it and laughed too. They spoke to him in very loud voices, as if he were stone deaf. They constructed sentences by way of teaching him the language in its purity, such as were addressed by the savages to Captain Cook or by Friday to Robinson Crusoe. Mrs. Plornish was particularly ingenious in this art, and attained so much celebrity for saying, "Me hope you leg well soon," that it was considered in the yard but a very short remove indeed from speaking Italian. Even Mrs. Plornish herself began to think that she had a natural call towards that language. As he became more popular, household objects were brought into requisition for his instruction in a copious vocabulary, and whenever he appeared in the yard, ladies would fly out at their doors, crying, "Mr. Baptiste, teapot. Mr. Baptiste, dustpan. Mr. Baptiste, flour dredger. Mr. Baptiste, coffee biggin," at the same time exhibiting those articles and penetrating him with a sense of the appalling difficulties of the Anglo-Saxon tongue. It was in this stage of his progress, and in about the third week of his occupation, that Mr. Pank's fancy became attracted by the little man. Mounting to his attic, attended by Mrs. Plornish as interpreter, he found Mr. Baptiste with no furniture but his bed on the ground, a table and a chair, carving with the aid of a few simple tools in the blithest way possible. "Now, old chap," said Mr. Panks, "pay up." He had his money ready, folded in a scrap of paper, and laughingly handed it in. Then, with a free action, threw out as many fingers of his right hand as there were shillings, and made a cut crosswise in the air for an odd sixpence. "Oh," said Mr. Panks, watching him wonderingly. "That's it, is it? You're a quick customer, it's all right. I didn't expect to receive it, though." Mrs. Plornish here interposed with great condescension, and explained to Mr. Baptiste, "E please, e glad get money." The little man smiled and nodded. His bright face seemed uncommonly attractive to Mr. Panks. "How's he getting on in his limb?" he asked Mrs. Plornish. "Oh, he's a deal better, sir," said Mrs. Plornish. "We expect next week he'll be able to leave off his stick entirely." The opportunity being too favourable to be lost, Mrs. Plornish displayed her great accomplishment by explaining this pardonable pride to Mr. Baptiste. "He hope you leg well soon." "He's a merry fellow too," said Mr. Panks, admiring him as if he were a mechanical toy. "How does he live?" "Why, sir," rejoined Mrs. Plornish, "he turns out to have quite a power of carving them flowers that you see him at now." Mr. Baptiste, watching their faces as they spoke, held up his work. Mrs. Plornish interpreted in her Italian manner on behalf of Mr. Panks, "E please, double good." "Can he live by that?" asked Mr. Panks. "He can live on very little, sir, and it is expected he will be able in time to make a very good living. Mr. Clennam got him to do, and gives him odd jobs besides at the works next door. Makes them for him, in short, when he knows he wants them." "And what does he do with himself now, when he ain't hard at it?" said Mr. Panks. "Why, not much as yet, sir, on accounts, I suppose, of not being able to walk much. But he goes about the yard, and he chats without particular understanding or being understood, and he plays with the children, and he sits in the sun. He'll sit down anywhere, as if it was an armchair, and he'll sing and he'll laugh." "Laugh?" echoed Mr. Panks. "He looks to me as if every tooth in his head was always laughing. But whenever he gets to the top of the steps at t'other end of the yard," said Mrs. Plornish, "he'll peep out in the curiousest way, so that some of us thinks he's peeping out towards where his own country is, and some of us thinks he's looking for somebody he don't want to see, and some of us don't know what to think." Mr. Baptiste seemed to have a general understanding of what she said, or perhaps his quickness caught and applied her slight action of peeping. In any case, he closed his eyes and tossed his head with the air of a man who had sufficient reasons for what he did, and said in his own tongue it didn't matter. Outro. What's outro? Said Pancks. It's a sort of general kind of expression, sir, said Mrs. Plornish. Is it? Said Pancks. Why then, outro to you, old chap. Good afternoon, outro. Mr. Baptiste, in his vivacious way, repeating the word several times, Mr. Pancks, in his duller way, gave him back once. From that time it became a frequent custom with Pancks, the gypsy, as he went home jaded at night, to pass round by Bleeding Heart Yard, go quietly up the stairs, look in at Mr. Baptiste's door, and, finding him in his room, to say, "Hello, old chap, outro," to which Mr. Baptiste would reply with innumerable bright nods and smiles, "Altro, signore, altro, altro, altro." After this highly condensed conversation, Mr. Pancks would go his way with an appearance of being lightened and refreshed. Chapter 26. Nobody's State of Mind. If Arthur Clennam had not arrived at that wise decision firmly to restrain himself from loving Pet, he would have lived on in a state of much perplexity, involving difficult struggles with his own heart. Not least of these would have been a contention always waging within it between a tendency to dislike Mr. Henry Gowan, if not to regard him with positive repugnance, and a whisper that the inclination was unworthy. A generous nature is not prone to strong aversions, and is slow to admit them even dispassionately. But when it finds ill will gaining upon it, and can discern between whiles that its origin is not dispassionate, such a nature becomes distressed. Therefore Mr. Henry Gowan would have clouded Clennam's mind, and would have been far oftener present to it than more agreeable persons and subjects, but for the great prudence of his decision aforesaid. As it was, Mr. Gowan seemed transferred to Daniel Doyce's mind. At all events, it so happened that it usually fell to Mr. Doyce's turn, rather than to Clennam's, to speak of him in the friendly conversations they held together. These were of frequent occurrence now, as the two partners shared a portion of a roomy house in one of the grave old-fashioned city streets, lying not far from the Bank of England by London Wall. Mr. Doyce had been to Twickenham to pass the day. Clennam had excused himself. Mr. Doyce was just come home. He put in his head at the door of Clennam's sitting-room to say good night. Come in," said Clennam. "I saw you were reading," returned Doyce as he entered, "and thought you might not care to be disturbed." But for the notable resolution he had made, Clennam really might not have known what he had been reading, really might not have had his eyes upon the book for an hour past, though it lay open before him. He shut it up rather quickly. "Are they well?" he asked. "Yes," said Doyce, "they are well. They are all well." Daniel had an old workmanlike habit of carrying his pocket-handkerchief in his hat. He took it out and wiped his forehead with it, slowly repeating, "They are all well, Miss Minnie looking particularly well, I thought. Any company at the cottage?" "No, no company." "And how did you get on, you four?" asked Clennam gaily. "There were 5 of us," returned his partner. "There was what's-his-name, he was there." "Who is he?" said Clennam. "Mr. Henry Gowan." "Ah, to be sure," cried Clennam with unusual vivacity. "Yes, I forgot him." "As I mentioned, you may remember," said Daniel Doyce, "he is always there on Sunday." Yes," returned Clennam, "I remember now." Daniel Doyce, still wiping his forehead, ploddingly repeated, "Yes, he was there. Oh, yes, he was there, and his dog, he was there too." "Miss Meagles is quite attached to the dog," observed Clennam. "Quite so," assented his partner. "More attached to the dog than I am to the man." "You mean Mr. I mean Mr. Gowan, most decidedly, said Daniel Doyce. There was a gap in the conversation which Clennam devoted to winding up his watch. Perhaps you are a little hasty in your judgment, he said. Our judgments, I am supposing, a general case? Of course, said Doyce, are so liable to be influenced by many considerations which, almost without our knowing it, are unfair, that it is necessary to keep a guard upon them. For instance, Mr. Gowan, quietly said Doyce, upon whom the utterance of the name almost always devolved, is young and handsome, easy and quick, has talent, and has seen a good deal of various kinds of life. It might be difficult to give an unselfish reason for being prepossessed against him. Not difficult for me, I think, Clennam, returned his partner. I see him bringing present anxiety, and I fear future sorrow, into my old friend's house. I see him wearing deeper lines into my old friend's face, the nearer he draws to, and the oftener he looks at, the face of his daughter. In short, I see him with a net about the pretty and affectionate creature whom he will never make happy. We don't know, said Clennam, almost in the tone of a man in pain, that he will not make her happy. We don't know, returned his partner, that the earth will last another 100 years, but we think it highly probable. Well, well, said Clennam, we must be hopeful, and we must at least try to be, if not generous, which in this case we have no opportunity of being, just. We will not disparage this gentleman because he is successful in his addresses to the beautiful object of his ambition, and we will not question her natural right to bestow her love on one whom she finds worthy of it. Maybe, my friend, said Doyce, maybe also that she is too young and petted, too confiding and inexperienced to discriminate well. That, said Clennam, would be far beyond our power of correction. Daniel Doyce shook his head gravely and rejoined, I fear so. Therefore, in a word, said Clennam, we should make up our minds that it is not worthy of us to say any ill of Mr. Gowan. It would be a poor thing to gratify a prejudice against him, and I resolve, for my part, not to depreciate him. I am not quite so sure of myself, and therefore I reserve my privilege of objecting to him, returned the other. But if I am not so sure of myself, I am sure of you, Clennam, and I know what an upright man you are, and how much to be respected. Good night, my friend and partner. He shook his hand in saying this, as if there had been something serious at the bottom of their conversation, and they separated. By this time they had visited the family on several occasions, and had always observed that even a passing allusion to Mr. Henry Gowan, when he was not among them, brought back the cloud which had obscured Mr. Meagle's sunshine on the morning of the chance encounter at the ferry. If Clennam had ever admitted the forbidden passion into his breast, this period might have been a period of real trial. Under the actual circumstances, doubtless it was nothing. Equally, if his heart had given entertainment to that prohibited guest, his silent fighting of his way through the mental condition of this period might have been a little meritorious. In the constant effort not to be betrayed into a new phase of the besetting sin of his experience, the pursuit of selfish objects by low and small means, and to hold instead to some high principle of honour and generosity, there might have been a little merit. In the resolution not even to avoid Mr. Meagle's house, lest, in the selfish sparing of himself, he should bring any slight distress upon the daughter through making her the cause of an estrangement which he believed the father would regret, there might have been a little merit. In the modest truthfulness of always keeping in view the greater equality of Mr. Gowan's years and the greater attractions of his person and manner, there might have been a little merit. In doing all this and much more in a perfectly unaffected way and with a manful and composed constancy, while the pain within him, peculiar as his life and history, was very sharp, there might have been some quiet strength of character. But after the resolution he had made, of course he could have no such merits as these, and such a state of mind was nobody's. Mr. Gowan made it no concern of his whether it was nobody's or somebody's. He preserved his perfect serenity of manner on all occasions, as if the possibility of Clennam's presuming to have debated the great question were too distant and ridiculous to be imagined. He had always an affability to bestow on Clennam, and an ease to treat him with, which might of itself, in the superstitious case of his not having taken that sagacious course, have been a very uncomfortable element in his state of mind. "I quite regret you were not with us yesterday," said Mr. Henry Gowan, calling on Clennam the next morning. "We had an agreeable day up the river there." "So he had heard," Arthur said. "From your partner?" returned Henry Gowan. "What a dear old fellow he is." "I have a great regard for him." "By Jove, he is the finest creature," said Gowan. "So fresh, so green, trusts in such wonderful things." Here was one of the many little rough points that had a tendency to grate on Clennam's hearing. He put it aside by merely repeating that he had a high regard for Mr. Doyce. "He is charming. To see him mooning along to that time of life, laying down nothing by the way and picking up nothing by the way, is delightful. It warms a man. So unspoilt, so simple, such a good soul. Upon my life, Mr. Clennam, one feels desperately worldly and wicked in comparison with such an innocent creature. I speak for myself, let me add, without including you. You are genuine also." "Thank you for the compliment," said Clennam, ill at ease. "You are too, I hope." "So," rejoined the other. "To be candid with you, tolerably, I am not a great impostor. Buy one of my pictures, and I assure you, in confidence, it will not be worth the money. Buy one of another man's, any great professor who beats me hollow, and the chances are that the more you give, the more he'll impose upon you. They all do it." "All painters?" "Painters, writers, patriots, all the rest who have stands in the market. Give almost any man I know £10, and he will impose upon you to a corresponding extent. £1,000 to a corresponding extent. £10,000 to a corresponding extent. So great the success, so great the imposition. But what a capital world it is!" cried Gowan with warm enthusiasm. "What a jolly, excellent, lovable world it is!" "I had rather thought," said Clennam, "that the principle you mention was chiefly acted on by—" "By the Barnacles," interrupted Gowan, laughing. "By the political gentlemen who condescend to keep the Circumlocution Office." "Ah, but don't be hard upon the Barnacles," said Gowan, laughing afresh. "They are darling fellows. Even poor little Clarence, the born idiot of the family, is the most agreeable and most endearing blockhead. And by Jupiter, with a kind of cleverness in him, too, that would astonish you." "It would, very much," said Clennam dryly. "And after all," cried Gowan, with that characteristic balancing of his which reduced everything in the wide world to the same light weight, "though I can't deny that the Circumlocution Office may ultimately shipwreck everybody and everything, still, that will probably not be in our time, and it's a school for gentlemen." "It's a very dangerous, unsatisfactory, and expensive school to the people who pay to keep the pupils there, I am afraid," said Clennam, shaking his head. "Ah, you are a terrible fellow," returned Gowan airily. "I can understand how you have frightened that little donkey Clarence, the most estimable of moon-calves. I really love him, nearly out of his wits. But enough of him, and of all the rest of them. I want to present you to my mother, Mr. Clennam. Pray, do me the favour to give me the opportunity." In nobody's state of mind there was nothing Clennam would have desired less, or would have been more at a loss how to avoid. "My mother lives in a most primitive manner down in that dreary red-brick dungeon at Hampton Court," said Gowan. "If you would like to make your own appointments, suggest your own day for permitting me to take you there to dinner, you would be bored and she would be charmed. Really, that's the state of the case." What could Clennam say after this? His retiring character included a great deal that was simple in the best sense, because unpractised and unused, and in his simplicity and modesty, he could only say that he was happy to place himself at Mr. Gowan's disposal. Accordingly, he said it, and the day was fixed. And a dreaded day it was on his part, and a very unwelcome day when it came, and they went down to Hampton Court together. The venerable inhabitants of that venerable pile seemed, in those times, to be encamped there like a sort of civilized gypsies. There was a temporary air about their establishments, as if they were going away the moment they could get anything better. There was also a dissatisfied air about themselves, as if they took it very ill that they had not already got something much better. Genteel blinds and makeshifts were more or less observable as soon as their doors were opened. Screens not half high enough, which made dining rooms out of arched passages, and warded off obscure corners where footboys slept at night with their heads among the knives and forks, curtains which called upon you to believe that they didn't hide anything, panes of glass which requested you not to see them, many objects of various forms feigning to have no connection with their guilty secret, a bed, disguised traps in walls which were clearly coal cellars, affectations of no thoroughfares which were evidently doors to little kitchens. Mental reservations and artful mysteries grew out of these things. Callers looking steadily into the eyes of their receivers pretended not to smell cooking 3 feet off. People confronting closets accidentally left open pretended not to see bottles. Visitors, with their heads against a partition of thin canvas, and a page and a young female at high words on the other side, made believe to be sitting in a primeval silence. There was no end to the small social accommodation bills of this nature which the gypsies of gentility were constantly drawing upon and accepting for one another. Some of these bohemians were of an irritable temperament, as constantly soured and vexed by 2 mental trials. The first, the consciousness that they had never got enough out of the public. The second, the consciousness that the public were admitted into the building. Under the latter great wrong, a few suffered dreadfully, particularly on Sundays, when they had for some time expected the earth to open and swallow the public up, but which desirable event had not yet occurred, in consequence of some reprehensible laxity in the arrangements of the universe. Mrs. Gowan's door was attended by a family servant of several years' standing, who had his own crow to pluck with the public concerning a situation in the post office which he had been for some time expecting, and to which he was not yet appointed. He perfectly knew that the public could never have got him in, but he grimly gratified himself with the idea that the public kept him out. Under the influence of this injury, and perhaps of some little straightness and irregularity in the matter of wages, he had grown neglectful of his person and morose in mind, and now, beholding in Clennam one of the degraded body of his oppressors, received him with ignominy. Mrs. Gowan, however, received him with condescension. He found her a courtly old lady, formerly a beauty and still sufficiently well-favoured to have dispensed with the powder on her nose and a certain impossible bloom under each eye. She was a little lofty with him, so was another old lady, dark-browed and high-nosed, and who must have had something real about her, or she would not have existed, but it was certainly not her hair or her teeth or her figure or her complexion. So was a grey old gentleman of dignified and sullen appearance, both of whom had come to dinner. But as they had all been in the British Embassy way in sundry parts of the earth, and as a British Embassy cannot better establish a character with the Circumlocution Office than by treating its compatriots with illimitable contempt, else it would become like the embassies of other countries, Clennam felt that on the whole they let him off lightly. The dignified old gentleman turned out to be Lord Lancaster Stiltstalking, who had been maintained by the Circumlocution Office for many years as a representative of the Britannic Majesty abroad. This noble refrigerator had iced several European courts in his time, and had done it with such complete success that the very name of Englishman yet struck